Hi, I'm Jordan Schiller, and you're watching The People's History of Vermont. Ah, Coolidge Hall. A beautiful dorm located conveniently between the Stoner Woods and the Southwick Music Building. It's one of UVM's more, underrated dorms. Coolidge Hall is rather unique among UVM's buildings. Of 4 dorm buildings built in 1947, Coolidge is the only one that remains. But why is this magnificent and not at all dingy dorm building named Coolidge, I hear you asking? Well, it's named after a woman named Grace Coolidge, and is one of the few, relatively few, buildings at UVM that's named after a female. So who was Grace Coolidge, and why is this absolutely stellar building named after her? Let's go back to the studio, and I'll tell you over a hot bowl of ramen. That's good ramen. Okay, let's get started. January 3rd, 1879. Grace Anna Goodhue was born in Burlington, Vermont, specifically on Maple Street, where Champlain College currently is. Grace was the only child of a deacon and a worker on Lake Champlain steamboats. The Goodhues were a fairly well-off family. They were descendants of English Puritans, and counted a member of the first U.S. Congress as one of their ancestors. Grace was born with several health problems. She had some kind of impaired vision and what was described in doctors' papers as a weak spine. Though, like Theodore Roosevelt, she was active and athletic despite her disabilities and her medical issues. Grace was also an incredibly bright young woman, and while she was brought up with the expectations of, well, a woman in the late 19th century, she enjoyed hearing the stories of the Civil War from her grandfather, and she learned the mechanics of steamboat engines and engineering from her father. Grace received an excellent education, excelling at classes at Burlington High School, where she took a shine to music and elocution. Elocution is, from what I understand, the art of speaking clearly and without an accent, which is kind of an accent in and of itself. So Grace sounded exceptionally clear and sophisticated. After high school, Grace enrolled at our fine university, UVM, where she pursued a degree in education, much like your host. Additionally, she was a member of the UVM Glee Club. She acted at the Royal Tyler Theater, which was built her junior year. She was also a founder of the UVM chapter of Pi Beta Phi, a sorority which still exists to this day. After graduating in 1902, Grace moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, where she enrolled at the Clark School for the Deaf, where she learned to teach students with hearing issues, which became a cause that she would hold near and dear to her for the rest of her life. In 1903, she was in a fairly serious relationship with somebody named Frank Joyner, who was a member of her church. It was so serious that they had basically had an understanding that they would end up getting married. It was a pre-engagement engagement. That is, until Grace met Calvin. Calvin Coolidge was an absolute daddy. 5'10", conservative Republican, Amherst graduate, successful lawyer, 10 out of 10 jawline, absolute stud. He was also a Vermonter, like Grace was, born in Plymouth Notch to be exact. Grace first saw Calvin while he was shaving in a window with his top hat on, which was a very normal thing to do at the time. Grace laughed and thought that was cute. Needless to say, Grace soon ditched her old man, and her and Calvin started dating, and Calvin adoringly referred to her as Sunshine. The Coolidges got married on October 4th, 1905. Grace kept working as a teacher in Massachusetts, while Calvin began climbing the political ladder. First, he was mayor, and then president of the Massachusetts Senate, and then governor of Massachusetts, where he made a name for himself among conservatives by breaking up the police officers' union strike. All the while, the Coolidge family grew, welcoming John Coolidge in 1906 and Calvin Jr. in 1908. Grace and Calvin were said to have a good relationship, although she admitted that they were frankly quite different, and that while she was outgoing and gregarious, while her husband, despite his political success, earned the nickname Silent Cal. Calvin Coolidge was selected to be the running mate of Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding in the 1920 presidential election, where the two squared off against Democratic Senator James Cox and his running mate, some jackass loser named Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was never heard from again after this election. The Harding-Coolidge ticket won in a landslide, making Grace the second lady of the United States. There wasn't really a ton for the vice president to do, much less the vice president's wife, but Grace Coolidge made herself useful, forming the Ladies of the Senate, a small social organization of the wives of many of the senators from both parties, which formed political relationships which helped her awkward husband immensely with soft lobbying of his political rivals. After 2.5 years of leading the country, cheating on his wife, and doing a series of financial crimes, President Harding died of a sudden cardiac arrest on June 23, 1923. The Coolidges were staying in Plymouth Notch at Calvin's farmhouse home in Vermont when they heard the news. Calvin was woken up at 2:30 a.m. and told, "All right, wise guy, you think you're so smart. You get to be the president now." He took a time to think. He said a quick prayer, and then had the oath of office administered by his father, Calvin John Coolidge. When asked where he got the notion that he could administer the presidential oath of office to his son, the elder Coolidge simply said, "Nobody ever told me I couldn't." Calvin then went back to bed around 3 a.m., having become the 30th president of the United States, and the only U.S. president to have ever been sworn in on Vermont soil. As president, Calvin was the archetype of Republicans to come. He lowered taxes, kept the country out of international squabbles, ignored signs of an imminent stock market crash, and signed a remarkably racist immigration bill. Just as Calvin Coolidge's re-election campaign was getting started, tragedy struck, as the Coolidge's second son, Calvin Jr., died from a blister that he received whilst playing tennis without socks on. Both Coolidges retreated back to the Vermont farmhouse to mourn and to rebuild. Despite the loss of his son making Calvin even more withdrawn and silent, he comfortably won a second term, coasting off of the strong economy and illegal booze of the 1920s. Through the campaign, Grace had been appearing at campaign stops and writing open letters to women, urging them to vote, not because her husband was running, but because this was the second presidential election in history where they even had the option to vote. Grace was the absolute model of a first lady, helping her very awkward husband through social situations and doing general charity work and keeping up with his support for the education of blind and deaf people, even taking occasion to meet with Helen Keller at the White House. On Thanksgiving Day, 1926, a feast was assembled at the White House, featuring the usual fare: turkey, corn, squash, potatoes, and a live raccoon, which was the style at the time, that was going to be baked into a pie and served with dinner. However, Grace Coolidge took a liking to this particular trash panda and decided to spare its life and keep it as a pet. Naming it Rebecca, she absolutely adored this little critter and gave it bubble baths. To quote from Grace's diary,
"We had a housemaid for her in one of the large trees with a wire fence built around it for protection. We kept her chained when out of doors, but in the house she had her liberty. She enjoyed nothing better than being placed in a bathtub with little water in it and given a cake of soap with which to play. In this fashion, she would amuse herself for an hour or more."
I don't even have anything to say about this besides the fact that that's the most delightful thing I have ever heard in my life, and makes Grace easily in the top 5 first ladies for the raccoon thing alone. This is running a bit long, but I have to go over the Coolidge's other pets. Calvin received a pet black bear from the president of Mexico and decided to name it Tax Reduction. He also kept a bobcat named Smokey Bob, and also received a pygmy hippo from the founder of the Firestone Tire Company. If that wasn't normal enough, after the Secret Service forced Calvin to stop horseback riding because it was so dangerous, Calvin had a mechanical horse built and kept in a secret closet in the White House, like a 1920s exercise bike. Needless to say, both of the Coolidges absolutely loved animals, both real and mechanical. Anyways, 1928 rolls around and Coolidge's social meter runs out and he needs some time to recharge, so he declines to run for the presidency again. He throws all of his support behind his Commerce Secretary, Herbert Hoover. The president and the First Lady retreat into privacy, moving towards a gated community in Northampton, and they had planned to move back to Plymouth Notch in Vermont to retire, although they never got the chance. When offered $2 million to build his presidential library, Calvin turned it down and instead donated it to a school for the deaf, to the cause that his wife loved so dearly. Calvin died of a coronary blood clot in 1933, which was probably for the best because he would have had an absolute heart attack if he had seen the rest of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidential term, where he turned the federal government into a socialist jobs program. As a widow, Grace wrote extensively on her experiences in the White House, and she continued her community service with the Red Cross and advocated for the admittance of European refugees who were fleeing the Nazi regime. She also probably voted for Franklin Roosevelt, her husband's former political and ideological rival. She vocally opposed the nuclear bombings of Japan at the end of World War II and joined Eleanor Roosevelt in supporting the formation of the United Nations. Through her advocacy for the deaf, she became acquainted with a young, up-and-coming senator named John F. Kennedy and met with every successive First Lady until her death in 1957.
It has been my experience that those who are truly great are the most simple people at heart, the most considerate and understanding, with a decided aversion of talking about themselves.
Easy for her to say. She didn't realize that one day UVM's nicest, cleanest, and least stingy dorm would be named after her. I think as a whole we can learn a lot about relationships from the Coolidges. They were kind of polar opposites, and Grace's outgoing, gregarious nature really balanced out Calvin's very cold, conservative introversion. Calvin Coolidge isn't exactly a household name, and neither is Grace. But she should be, because she has bones so hard. Compassionate, intelligent, athletic, and even a little bit eccentric. She's really a model of what a First Lady can be. Beauty, she's Grace, she's the First Lady of the United States, and she owned a pet raccoon. Thanks for watching.